Presidential action posted by the White House on Thursday revealed that the president is calling up U.S. military reserve units to deploy to active duty in Europe in what's been called Operation Atlantic Resolve. Half of Politico letter foreign policy experts calling for more arms to Ukraine have ties to arms industry. An open letter signed by 46 foreign policy experts calling for more arms shipments to Ukraine that was published in Politico failed to mention ties of nearly half of the signatories to the defense industry. All right, welcome back, folks. This is the American Journal, Infowars.com, band.video. We'll go out to your calls this segment. We're talking about, move on now, we'll talk about the war in Ukraine, the latest NATO summit, and some troubling signals seem to hint that we are moving full steam ahead towards direct and open conflict with nuclear-armed Russia. 300,000 NATO soldiers now being deployed along the Russian border, while the White House has just called up American military reserve units to deploy to active duty in Europe in Operation Atlantic Resolve. Presidential action posted by the White House on Thursday revealed that the president is calling up U.S. military reserve units to deploy to active duty in Europe in what's been called Operation Atlantic Resolve. They're deploying 3,000 total members at any one time, of whom no more than 450 may be members of the individual ready reserve as they deem necessary, and to terminate the service of those units and members ordered to active duty. President Biden is readying military forces to deploy to Europe. He made a promise to the American people in March 2022 that U.S. troops would not be sent to fight in Ukraine on behalf of that nation's border or in service of waging war against Russia. Of course, there have been and continue to be American soldiers on the ground in in Ukraine, fighting Russia. This has been revealed by the Discord leaks, exposing that actually a number of Americans have died in Ukraine. We also have heard from officials on the American NATO side saying, well, we deploy NATO soldiers, but you put them in a Ukrainian uniform, now it's a Ukrainian soldier. See how that works? It's called a false flag. We love doing them. Sending cluster bombs, obviously, in just what is a open war crime. The White House is also trying to prevent oversight of Ukrainian aid. The NDAA includes a provision that will create an inspector general for the proxy war in Ukraine, modeled after the special inspector general for Afghans reconstruction. Just making sure the money is going where it's supposed to be going. Of course, we've heard stories throughout the last year of weapons showing up elsewhere in Africa, weapons that were sent to Ukraine showing up in Africa, of some of the Ukrainian officials responsible for the distribution of these weapons buying themselves new million-dollar homes on the Black Sea. Multi-million-dollar homes, I should say, yachts, all sorts of other stuff, seemingly getting very rich while their country's being destroyed in war. And just like the COVID relief funds, right? We're still just now learning about the scams that took place 3+ years ago when the COVID relief funds were robbed to the tune of $100 billion. But the White House doesn't think that the American people or their representatives in Congress have a right to actually just make sure that the money we're spending and the weapons we're sending are actually going to what they're intended to go to. Not that it's even a good thing that they're going there, but it's at least better that they go to the people that they're intended to go to rather than be resold to some terrorist group in Africa for the benefit of a Ukrainian oligarch. Half of Politico letter foreign policy experts calling for more arms to Ukraine have ties to arms industry. This is a report from Infowars.com. An open letter signed by 46 foreign policy experts calling for more arms shipments to Ukraine that was published in Politico failed to mention ties of nearly half of the signatories to the defense industry, allegedly glossing over conflicts of interest, the Washington-based Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft claimed. So on June 5th, Politico published an open letter entitled Ukraine Needs a Roadmap to NATO Membership ASAP, calling for Western leaders at the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania this week to commit to supplying Ukraine with weapons, fighter jets, and tanks in sufficient quantities to prevail on the battlefield. The letter argued that the Washington leaders helped facilitate a comprehensive transition of the weapon system being used to wage war against Russia. Make sure it's up to NATO standards. Basically, this letter calling for just more weapons, more coordination, more war. And they forget to mention that half of the people who signed the letter have ties to the arms industry. Yeah, the executive from Nabisco is telling you need to eat more cookies. Like, yeah, obviously, yeah, these are people who profit by death and destruction. They profit by war. They profit by conflict. They're doing everything they can to increase those things. From InfoWars, Biden authorizes military to call reservists to active duty to support Ukraine war. And here's the actual order from whitehouse.gov, ordering the select reserve and certain members of the individual ready reserve of the armed forces to active duty. If there's anybody in our audience that is one of these people, I really want you to call in. I really want you to call in if you are a reserve unit and have been called up for Operation Atlantic Resolve. How do you feel about being sent to Europe to fight this pointless, horrifying war? What do you think about being the first in what could very well be millions of American young men and women being sent overseas to fight for basically the Bidens and a bunch of Ukrainian oligarchs? How do you feel about that? I wonder. I know how I'd feel about it. And finally, we have this story from the Japan Times. Zelensky gets less than he wanted from NATO, but takes home real gains. The Ukrainian president's performance at NATO summit this week was vintage Volodymyr Zelensky. Go in hard, push allies beyond their comfort zone, and go home with less than you said you wanted, but more than seemed likely only a few months ago. Zelensky left Western leaders in Vilnius with little choice but to publicly snub his demand to set a clear path for Ukraine to join the U.S. military-led alliance. U.S.-led military alliance, but the summit's assurances of unwavering support, new pledges of military aid, and a framework for security guarantees against Russia showed how far Ukraine has already moved towards the Euro-Atlantic camp during the war. So again, he didn't get everything he wanted, but he did get 300 NATO soldiers deployed. He got promises for new weapons of dubious legality and all sorts of other commitments that will contribute to this endless cycle of senseless murder. Again, we'll go out to your calls, but the first call I want to go to is Simon. He's been keeping a track of all of this, the whole NATO event. We only have about a minute left, so if you're okay with it, Simon, we'll wait till the next segment. We'll hear what's been going on from you a little bit longer than this 1 minute. But again, let me just tell you, InfoWars has been on the same, we've had the same stance since I was in middle school, basically, right? The reason I first started listening to InfoWars is because I hated the Iraq War, and it seemed like there was only one outlet in America that was pointing out the hypocrisies, the lies, the deception, the destruction of that totally pointless and now largely recognized as absolutely ill-advised adventurism in the Middle East. It's not that hard. It's not that hard to figure out what side InfoWars is going to be on. It's the side of peace. It's the side of innocence. It's the side of justice. It's the side of reality. And I really hope you can support us in this mission that we've been on for the last 20 plus years by going to InfoWarsStore.com. InfoWarsStore.com. It's the only way we get support. All right, folks, welcome back. Simon in Florida calling in about what the outcome has been of NATO. Simon, thanks so much for calling in. Obviously, I agree with the headline that we just read saying that Zelensky still got a lot, but didn't get quite everything he was hoping for because, again, it's a defensive alliance. You can't join a defensive alliance once you're already in a war. That should be obvious to anybody, but they're trying to do it anyway. Thanks for calling in. What is your reading, and have you been paying close attention to what's been going on in Lithuania this week?
Yes, yes, I very much have.
So.
it's important to realize that that hasn't been the only game in town. There's been a lot of other stuff going on, both with the Iranians and also in Indonesia with the ASEAN conference, which is just wrapping up as we speak. But in terms of the NATO meeting in Vilnius, it's important for folks to understand that there are actually essentially two outcomes from the NATO side of things and then a Russian response. So we had this massive 90 paragraphs, some of which were a page long, NATO communique, which was essentially negotiated in advance and gave Zelensky in Ukraine some of what they wanted. And he reacted very strongly to that. And they literally had to send diplomats to him to intervene and say, don't go off the deep end, otherwise you're going to completely destroy your carefully crafted warrior hero public image in Western Europe that we've carefully cultivated. So he was much better behaved the next day. And in return, and this is what the article from the Japan Times that you were alluding to, he actually got a very large promise, but not from all 31 members of NATO, but from the 7 members of the G7. So they put out a declaration which in many regards could actually be seen as a framework convention for the individual countries to fill in bilateral security guarantees to Ukraine so that America, Germany, France, Italy, Britain, Japan, and I've missed one. But anyway, you get the idea, so that even though it's not a collective promise from NATO, those are the major components of NATO, and they're all making promises to him. Now, the somewhat shocking thing is the Japanese obviously are involved in that. They've now become a partner nation with NATO through this thing called the ITPP, which is the Individually Tailored Partnership Program. That also has been extended to Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. And this is part of the mission creep of NATO, very much extending its activities now into the Indo-Pacific, which has obviously got the Chinese hopping mad, and they're reacting very, very strongly to that. So it's important for people to understand that it's not just the NATO track, but it's also the G7 track, which is not, as is usually the case, talking about economic, but they're talking about military stuff.
It's so interesting, Simon, how the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is suddenly getting involved in the South Pacific. I mean, talk about mission creep. It's creeped on the other side of the world. So, I mean, what's your takeaway and what's Russia's takeaway from this? Because obviously they got the 300,000 NATO troops on the border. They got Sweden closer than ever to joining NATO, more mission creep. And then you've got Biden and his White House releasing this, or basically summoning up 3,000 reservists to be sent to Europe in Operation Atlantic Security or whatever it's called. I mean, how close are we to outright conflict? Do you think, and does Russia think?
Well, so I'll deal with that directly. And I actually, your die-hard fans, Ben and Hodges, who are in Nebraska, and they have that Rumble show called Road to Liberty. They reached out to me, and we did a whole hour last night talking about the Russian response. And obviously, we don't have anything like that kind of time, but I'll just give you a rough idea. So you're familiar, I'm sure, with their a spokeswoman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Maria Zakharova, who, unlike many of our American government representatives, actually has a PhD in history. They put out a response that, if you could imagine Rodney Dangerfield from Caddyshack doing a stand-up comedy routine with punchline after punchline after punchline, or maybe Chevy Chase roasting Ronald Reagan. This is how it reads, right? So it's got things like the collective progressive West refuses to accept the rise of the multipolar world and intends to use every instrument at its disposal, including military methods, to defend its hegemony. Another one, it says, the alliance is unable to adapt to the new geopolitical reality and real security requirements, while magnifying the alleged threat in the East. The United States and its vassals intend to use NATO as the main instrument of their global hegemony and the containment of the centers of the developing multipolar world. And it goes on and on and on like that with, those two are slightly similar, but real riposte after riposte. Now, you've got to bear in mind that this is playing very, very well in the rest of the world,
Right.
other than NATO. And if you look at how the Russian foreign minister was received at the ASEAN conference yesterday and today in Jakarta in Indonesia, he literally was being flocked by crowds like a rock star. I mean, he's a 70-year-old, rather erudite, snappily dressed foreign minister, much like our famous Secretaries of State Baker and Schultz. You remember that they were really highly regarded in the world of diplomacy, and the same really applies to Sergei Lavrov and his very skilled spokeswoman, Maria. But going on
it sounds like Russia. It sounds like Russia is sort of giddy about what has happened at NATO. They're sort of happy to see the cracks in the facade and are sort of reinvigorated by seeing NATO sort of stumbling its way through this conflict.
Well, it's the line, as we often discuss, and you've obviously realized this for many months, both in relation to Russia's choices and also the forces aligning against China, the lines are being drawn very, very starkly. In the NATO communique, they twice demanded the unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from the entirety of Ukraine, whose borders and territorial sovereignty NATO is very keen to uphold. So they obviously don't seem to care very much about the U.S. southern border. And in their declaration, they insisted that that area would include Crimea. Now, the real problem there is, and some people have made a distinction where they're asking for withdrawal, not for surrender. But given that Russia regards Crimea as being an integral part of it, as it was for a couple of hundred years before Khrushchev, wild drunk, decided to transfer it from Russia to Ukraine in the 1950s, this is still leading to men and women, in some cases, being thrown into this meat grinder. And so we see now it looks like the Ukrainians are going to mobilize an additional 200,000 new conscripts at the same time as we see America, who are going to be calling up a combination of 3,000 reservists combined with the 450 individual ready reserves. But I fear that's the thin end of the wedge.
We're just getting started, Simon. Thank you so much for your very valuable insight. I've just tweeted out the link to the video with Roads to Liberty and Simon. So if you want a full breakdown, go to my Twitter, Harrison H. Smith, and I've linked it there.
The globalists are only humans. Yeah, they have control of the central banks, they have a lot of power, but they can be defeated. But some of their operations are going to take decades to stop. But one thing you can do right now is take control of your body and your family's body by purifying the water that you drink and that you cook with. And you do it with the highest quality gravity-fed filter out there. This thing does 10,000 gallons. You can sit there and put hundreds of gallons through it a day. It purifies very quickly, and it cuts out thousands of chemicals to non-detectable levels. This is what I use, what my family uses. It's the very best system out there for the lowest price. For a limited time, 10% off on top of that, exclusively at InfoWarsStore.com on the Alexa Pure water filtration system, in stock, and replacement filters for folks that need those in stock. Get it today, and it funds the InfoWar. Don't procrastinate. This is one of the main areas we can take control of our lives and stop the globalists from hitting us with poison that they allow in the water supply. In some cases, they add to the water supply like fluoride.